In the heart of a sprawling mansion, surrounded by wealth and grandeur, lived Jonathan Davenport, a man who seemingly had it all, yet felt nothing. But one evening, a single haunting melody, played by an unexpected guest, would awaken memories he'd buried long ago. Memories that would lead him back to a forgotten dream and a chance at redemption. The Davenport mansion glittered with opulence as esteemed guests in expensive suits and dresses poured into the grand ballroom. Jonathan Davenport, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his 40s, observed the scene from a distance with a smirk, his piercing gaze roaming over the crowd. Jonathan was a man known for his wealth, influence, and unyielding ruthlessness in business. To those around him, he seemed invincible, a self-made man who stopped at nothing to get what he wanted. Tonight's party was a spectacle of grandeur, a testament to his success. The massive chandelier cast a golden glow over the ballroom, while delicate crystal glasses clinked in the hands of the wealthy guests, their laughter and polite conversations creating a soft murmur that filled the room. Jonathan took a sip of his whiskey, savoring the burn as he watched his guests mingle. For him, hosting these parties wasn't just about socializing. It was about power. He enjoyed seeing people vying for his attention, basking in the wealth and influence he commanded. In the midst of the glamour, Jonathan's eyes landed on a young woman moving quietly among the guests, a tray of champagne flutes balanced expertly in her hands. Grace. A waitress, young and unassuming, she navigated through the crowd with ease. Her expression calm and reserved. Unlike the other waitstaff who exchanged smiles and pleasantries with the guests, Grace seemed to keep her distance, her gaze focused solely on her task. Jonathan frowned as he watched her, something about her presence pricking at a memory he couldn't quite place. She was so different from the lavish surroundings, an unpolished gem in a room filled with diamonds. Intrigued and mildly irritated by the sense of familiarity, he called over one of his staff. "Who's that girl?" he asked, nodding in Grace's direction. "Oh, that's Grace, sir. She's one of the new hires from the catering service," the staff member replied. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he studied her. Something about her was unsettling. Her presence seemed like an affront to the controlled world he'd built. He decided he would test her, push her out of her comfort zone. It was a habit of his, exposing weakness where he saw it, reminding others of their place. He walked over to her, his commanding presence drawing the attention of guests nearby. "Grace, isn't it?" he said, his tone casual but laced with a hint of challenge. Grace looked up, meeting his gaze with a steady calm that surprised him. "Yes, sir." A flicker of annoyance passed through him. He had expected her to look away, to appear intimidated. "I hear you know how to play the piano," he said, his tone smooth yet authoritative. "Am I correct?" Grace's face remained impassive, but Jonathan noticed a brief flicker of something, surprise perhaps, in her eyes. "I do, sir," she replied, her voice steady. "Good," he said with a faint smirk. "Then entertain us. Let's see if your talent is worth more than serving champagne." The room grew quiet as Jonathan's voice carried over the crowd. The guests turned their attention toward Grace, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and pity. Jonathan could see her discomfort in the slight tightening of her jaw, but she maintained her composure, giving a polite nod. "Of course, sir," she said, her tone giving away nothing. Jonathan gestured toward the grand piano in the corner of the room, and the crowd parted, allowing her a clear path. He leaned back, folding his arms as he watched her walk toward the piano, a smirk playing on his lips. This was his world, his domain, and he enjoyed reminding people of that. If she played poorly, she'd be humiliated, and if she played well, it would only serve to entertain him further. As Grace sat down at the piano, a hush fell over the room. She rested her fingers on the keys, her gaze distant, as if she were somewhere far away. For a brief moment she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and then she began to play. The first notes that filled the room were soft, gentle, like a whisper. But as she continued, the melody grew, swelling with an intensity that captivated the entire audience. The music was hauntingly beautiful, carrying an undercurrent of sorrow and longing. It was as if each note held a memory, a story that spoke of lost dreams and forgotten promises. Jonathan felt an unexpected tightness in his chest as he listened, his smirk fading. There was something achingly familiar about the melody. He couldn't place it, yet it stirred something deep within him, a memory he had long buried beneath layers of wealth, success, and ruthlessness. As the music continued, flashes of his own past came rushing back to him. He remembered his own hands on the piano keys, the joy and passion he'd once felt when he played. As a young man, before the money and power had taken over, he dreamed of being a pianist. He'd loved the freedom, the creativity, the way music had once been his refuge. But those dreams had been sacrificed for something he deemed more important: wealth, success, the admiration of others. Jonathan's gaze focused on Grace, watching her every movement. It was then that he recognized the melody. It was the same one he had once taught to a young girl years ago, the daughter of his family's caretaker. He remembered her now, a little girl with big eyes and a shy smile, who had watched him with awe as he played. He had taught her this piece, showing her how to express herself through music. And now, that little girl was sitting before him, a grown woman, playing the very same melody with a depth of emotion that he had never achieved. The realization hit him like a blow. This wasn't just a stranger. This was Grace, the girl he'd once known, the girl who had admired him when he was still a man with dreams. The girl he'd forgotten as he climbed his way to the top, discarding people and passions alike. A murmur spread through the crowd as the music swelled to its climax, Grace's hands moving with precision and grace. Each note seemed to pierce Jonathan's defenses, breaking through the armor he had carefully constructed over the years. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as memories flooded his mind. Memories of the young man he had once been, full of hope and ambition, before he'd traded it all for a life that now felt hollow. As the last note faded, a silence fell over the room. The guests stood in awe, their expressions softened by the beauty of the music they had just witnessed. Grace sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the keys, her eyes focused somewhere far beyond the room. Jonathan took a step forward, feeling the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. He had brought her here with the intent to humiliate her, to show his dominance. But instead, she had reminded him of the man he had lost along the way. She had reminded him of his own humanity. The applause began, hesitant at first, then growing louder as the guests erupted into appreciation. Grace stood up, her expression calm, and gave a small, polite bow. Her gaze met Jonathan's briefly, and he saw something in her eyes that both challenged and forgave him. A look that acknowledged his actions, but offered no judgment. Jonathan's mind swirled as he watched her walk away, disappearing back into the crowd. The music lingered in his mind, haunting him with a painful clarity. He realized that, in his pursuit of power, he had lost the one thing that had once given him true joy. As the night wore on, Jonathan found himself alone in his study, the echo of Grace's music still resonating in his mind. He stared at his reflection in the window, the powerful, wealthy man he had become. But now, that reflection felt like a stranger. In the silence of his mansion, Jonathan Davenport began to question everything he had built. And for the first time in years, he felt a longing, not for wealth or power, but for meaning, for the music he had once loved, and for the chance to reclaim the part of himself he had lost. The clock in Jonathan's study chimed softly, marking midnight, yet he remained rooted by the window, the city lights shimmering in the distance. The world outside was quiet, but inside his mind, Grace's melody played on repeat, each note a ghost that haunted him, refusing to fade. It had been years since he'd heard that song, the one he'd once taught to a young girl who looked at him as though he held all the beauty in the world at his fingertips. Back then, he had felt alive. He'd spent hours lost in the music, pouring his heart into each melody, letting his soul speak through the notes. He had dreamt of becoming a pianist, of traveling the world and performing in grand concert halls. But that dream had withered, replaced by another, one that glittered with wealth and power, but was devoid of the joy he'd once known. And now the music had returned, unexpected and unwelcome, dredging up memories he had buried long ago. He could still see the young girl's eyes, wide with wonder, as she watched him play. Grace, the girl he had taught, the one he had shared his passion with before he'd abandoned it all. The thought disturbed him deeply. Jonathan had not just lost his music, he had become someone who could no longer even recognize that innocent, hopeful part of himself. The man he was now would have mocked the dreamer he once was, dismissing him as naive, foolish. Yet, as he replayed the melody in his mind, he realized that he had once been truly happy, long before he'd chased after his fortune. The door to his study opened, interrupting his thoughts, and he turned to see his assistant, Mark, stepping in. "Sir, the last guests have left," Mark said, keeping his tone low. "I thought you'd want to know." Jonathan nodded absently, still lost in thought. "Thank you, Mark. You may go." Mark hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. "Sir, is everything all right? You seem troubled." Jonathan forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "I'm fine, just reminiscing." Mark studied him for a moment before nodding and retreating, closing the door softly behind him. Alone once more, Jonathan let out a sigh, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life building an empire, but for what? To fill his mansion with people he barely knew? To flaunt his wealth in empty displays of grandeur? The realization was bitter, a sharp stab of regret that left him feeling hollow. Unable to resist the pull of the past any longer, he left his study and made his way down the winding hallways of his mansion, his footsteps echoing softly. He entered the grand ballroom, now empty and silent, and approached the piano where Grace had performed earlier. Sitting down, he rested his hands on the keys, his fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the familiar notes. He closed his eyes and let his fingers press down, the first notes echoing softly in the empty room. He began to play, hesitant at first, his hands stiff from years of neglect. But as he continued, the music began to flow, the melody filling the room with a haunting beauty that felt like a balm to his soul. The memories returned with each note, images of his younger self, of a life he had left behind in pursuit of something he no longer wanted. As he played, he heard a faint sound behind him, and he turned to see Grace standing in the doorway, watching him with a mixture of surprise and sadness. She seemed hesitant, unsure whether to interrupt, but Jonathan gave her a nod, inviting her in. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly, stepping into the room. I heard the music." Jonathan let out a weary sigh, his hands falling from the keys. "You didn't intrude, Grace. In fact, I think you're the only one who truly understands what this means to me." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "You used to love music, didn't you?" He nodded, feeling a pang of regret. "Yes, a long time ago. But I gave it up. I thought it was impractical, foolish even. I wanted something more, something that felt more real, more powerful." Grace's eyes softened. "Power isn't the same as happiness, Mr. Davenport. Sometimes, the things that seem impractical are the very things that give our lives meaning." Jonathan looked away, the truth of her words striking him deeply. He had traded his passion for the hollow pursuit of wealth, leaving behind the very thing that had once made him feel alive. And now he was left with a life that felt as empty as the echoing notes in the ballroom. "I didn't even recognize you," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't realize you were the girl I taught all those years ago." Grace smiled faintly. "I didn't expect you to. You've changed, a lot." There was no judgment in her tone, but Jonathan felt the weight of her words like a blow. He had changed, and not for the better. The young man who had once loved music, who had shared that love so freely, was now a distant memory, replaced by someone he barely recognized. "Why did you come back?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You could have left that part of your life behind." Grace's gaze grew distant, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "I did leave it behind for a time. But music, it's a part of who I am. No matter how far I ran, it was always there, calling me back. I think I came back because I wanted to remember what it felt like to love something so deeply, to have something worth holding on to." Jonathan felt a pang of envy. Grace had held on to the very thing he had abandoned. She had faced hardships, yet she still clung to the passion that had once brought them together. In her, he saw a reflection of the person he had lost, a reminder of the man he could have been. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Jonathan's mind raced with questions, regrets, memories. He wanted to ask her how she had stayed true to herself, how she had managed to hold on to the music while he had lost himself in the pursuit of wealth. But he didn't know where to begin. Finally, Grace broke the silence, her voice gentle. "It's never too late, you know, to go back to the things that matter." Jonathan met her gaze, the truth of her words resonating within him. He had spent years convincing himself that he was too far gone, that the life he had chosen was the only one available to him. But as he looked at Grace, he felt a spark of hope, a possibility that he hadn't dared to consider. "Do you think I can find it again?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The passion, the joy, the music?" Grace's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I think it's been waiting for you, Mr. Davenport. You just have to be willing to let it in." Jonathan's heart swelled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The path ahead was uncertain, a journey back to a part of himself that he had buried beneath layers of ambition and ruthlessness. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a yearning to reclaim the life he had lost. As Grace turned to leave, Jonathan called after her, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "Grace, thank you for reminding me of who I was." She smiled, a warmth in her gaze that eased the ache in his chest. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Davenport. Just don't lose yourself again." With those words, she left, leaving Jonathan alone with his thoughts and the quiet echo of her melody lingering in the air. He sat at the piano for a long time, his hands hovering over the keys, as if waiting for permission to play again. Slowly, he pressed down, the familiar notes filling the empty room, each one a step closer to the man he had once been. And as the night wore on, Jonathan made a silent promise to himself that he would find his way back, that he would reclaim the music, the joy, and the person he had once loved. The following days were unlike any Jonathan had experienced in years. His once meticulously scheduled life was punctuated by moments of silence, reflection, and the persistent hum of Grace's melody echoing through his mind. At the office, he found himself distracted, his thoughts drifting away from deals and numbers, lingering instead on memories of music, dreams, and simpler days. One afternoon, as he sat in his corner office overlooking the city, Jonathan's mind replayed Grace's words from their conversation in the ballroom. "Power isn't the same as happiness. Sometimes, the things that seem impractical are the very things that give our lives meaning." The truth in her words had struck him deeply. He had built his life on practical decisions, on investments and strategies that prioritized profit and power. And yet, he could no longer ignore the hollow feeling that accompanied each of those decisions, a creeping realization that his wealth had come at the expense of something far more valuable. Unable to focus, Jonathan stood abruptly, grabbed his coat, and left the office. His staff exchanged surprised glances but said nothing. After all, he was Jonathan Davenport, a man who rarely explained himself. Jonathan drove aimlessly through the city, passing familiar streets and towering skyscrapers that had once felt like symbols of his success. But today they felt different, like silent witnesses to a life that had lost its purpose. Eventually, he found himself parking near the local park, a place he hadn't visited since his youth. He walked along the winding paths, watching children play, young couples laughing, and older folks sitting quietly, content in their simplicity. The scene felt foreign, and he realized with a pang that he had isolated himself from these simple joys for years. He took a seat on a bench near a small pond, staring at the rippling water. His hands rested on his lap, the fingers itching to find a piano, to feel the weight of the keys beneath them. The thought surprised him. He hadn't felt this urge in years, hadn't allowed himself to imagine returning to something he had deemed lost. Lost in thought, he didn't notice Grace approaching until she sat down beside him, offering a gentle smile. "Mr. Davenport," she greeted, her tone warm but cautious. "Grace," he replied, unable to hide his surprise. "What are you doing here?" She shrugged lightly. "I often come here after work. It's a good place to think." He nodded, feeling a strange comfort in her presence. The silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. Instead, it felt natural, as though they had known each other far longer than their brief encounters suggested. After a while, Jonathan spoke, his voice tinged with a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to express. "Grace, when you played that night, you stirred something in me, something I thought I had buried for good." She looked at him with understanding, her gaze gentle. "I'm glad. Music has a way of reaching places words can't." Jonathan let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "But I don't know if I can go back." I've built my entire life on this." He gestured vaguely, as if the city itself represented his empire. Money, power, influence. "I'm not sure I even know who I am outside of it." Grace's expression softened. "Sometimes we have to lose ourselves to find what truly matters. You may have built this life, but that doesn't mean it's the only one you're capable of living." Her words lingered in the air, each one carrying a weight that Jonathan couldn't ignore. He had spent so many years telling himself that his path was the only one that mattered, that abandoning his music had been necessary, even noble. But now, he could no longer deny the emptiness that shadowed his every achievement. "Did you ever lose yourself, Grace?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You speak as if you've found something most people spend their lives searching for." She smiled, though there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "I lost myself for a while. I thought that by leaving my past behind, I could escape the pain, the disappointments. But I realized that running only made things worse. It wasn't until I returned to the things I loved, the music, the memories, that I began to feel whole again." Jonathan nodded slowly, her words resonating deeply. He knew deep down that the music was his path to healing, to reclaiming the man he had once been. But the thought terrified him. Could he truly abandon the empire he had built? Could he turn his back on the wealth, the power that defined him? Grace seemed to sense his turmoil and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Mr. Davenport, sometimes rediscovering ourselves requires letting go of what we think we need. But that doesn't mean giving up everything. It just means finding balance, a way to honor both your past and present." Jonathan took a deep breath, the weight of her words settling over him. He had spent years focused solely on one goal, allowing it to consume him until he was nothing more than a shell, driven by ambition alone. But Grace was right. He didn't have to abandon everything. Perhaps there was a way to keep the parts of his life that mattered while also reconnecting with the music he had once loved. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in thought. Finally, Jonathan turned to her, a flicker of determination in his gaze. "Would you help me, Grace?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Help me find my way back to the music?" Grace's eyes lit up with a warmth that melted the last of his defenses. "Of course, Mr. Davenport. I'd be honored." The next day, Jonathan took the first tentative steps toward rediscovering his musical roots. He arranged to have a piano delivered to his study, an imposing grand piano that gleamed with the same elegance he had once aspired to embody. When it arrived, he stood before it, feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He hadn't touched a piano in years, and the thought of playing again felt both exhilarating and daunting. He sat down, his fingers hovering over the keys. Closing his eyes, he let his hands find the familiar notes, his mind recalling the lessons he had long forgotten. The first notes were shaky, uncertain, but as he continued, the melody began to flow, the music filling the room with a richness that he had missed more than he realized. Days turned into weeks, and with Grace's gentle guidance, Jonathan gradually reclaimed his passion for music. She would come by the mansion after her shifts, sitting beside him as he practiced, offering encouragement and advice. She reminded him of the basics, of the techniques he had once mastered. But more importantly, she reminded him of the joy that came with playing purely for the sake of expression. Their shared moments at the piano brought a closeness between them, a quiet understanding that transcended words. Grace became his anchor, his reminder of the young man he had once been, of the dreams he had abandoned. And slowly, as he found himself in the music, he began to see her not just as the girl he had once known, but as a woman who had brought light into his life when he needed it most. One evening, as they sat together after a particularly moving piece, Jonathan turned to her, his gaze earnest. "Grace, you've changed me, in ways I can't even begin to explain." She smiled, her eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and affection. "I think you've changed yourself, Mr. Davenport. I just reminded you of who you already were." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Jonathan felt a connection he hadn't experienced in years. A warmth that was neither power nor wealth, but something far deeper. Grace had become more than his guide. She had become his friend, his confidant, perhaps even more. As he sat beside her, his heart swelled with gratitude, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. He knew that his journey was far from over, But with Grace by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to use his music not just for himself, but for something greater. In that moment, Jonathan made a silent promise that he would find a way to bring the joy of music to others, to share the gift that Grace had reignited within him. And in doing so, he would finally reclaim the part of himself he had lost. Weeks passed, and the quiet melodies that filled Jonathan's mansion became as familiar as the daily rhythms of his life. The notes were no longer tentative. Each time he played, his fingers moved with growing confidence, weaving emotions he had long suppressed into every melody. Grace continued to join him most evenings, her presence a source of quiet encouragement that grounded him in this journey of rediscovery. One evening, as they finished playing a piece together, Jonathan set his hands on his lap and turned to Grace, an idea beginning to take shape in his mind. "Grace," he began slowly, as though testing his own thoughts, "you reminded me that music can be more than just sound. It can be healing, transformative. I'm realizing that I don't just want this for myself. I want to share it somehow." Grace looked at him, curiosity lighting her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," he admitted, glancing down at the piano keys. "But I want to use this gift I've rediscovered, for something beyond myself. I don't know exactly how, but I can feel that there's more I can do. Something meaningful." Grace's face softened, a smile breaking across her lips. "You're already doing something meaningful, Mr. Davenport. By allowing yourself to reconnect with this part of you, you're opening up to the world in ways you never have before. But if you're thinking of sharing music more broadly, that's a beautiful idea." The thought filled him with a strange exhilaration. For years, his goals had been coldly practical, centered around wealth and influence. But now, as he envisioned the possibility of bringing music to others, he felt a warmth, a sense of purpose that felt wholly different from his usual ambitions. "What if," he began, hesitant yet hopeful, "what if I started something for those who don't have access to this kind of beauty? A place where children, especially those with limited resources, can learn music and experience what I've found here. A music school." Grace's smile widened, her eyes shining with encouragement. "That would be wonderful, Jonathan. Music can be a lifeline, especially for children who feel lost or overlooked. Imagine the difference you could make." The excitement of the idea began to take hold, filling Jonathan with a new kind of ambition, one driven by compassion rather than power. He could see it so clearly. A school where children from all backgrounds could come to learn, to play, to create. A sanctuary where they could find joy and solace in the same way he had. A place where the healing power of music was available to all. The following days saw Jonathan immersed in planning. He reached out to architects, educators, and musicians, determined to bring his vision to life. His business acumen, once directed toward amassing wealth, now served him in a different capacity as he navigated the logistics of founding a school. Grace remained by his side, offering insights, ideas, and a perspective he valued deeply. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning, Jonathan and Grace sat in the music room, sipping tea as they reviewed potential locations for the school. Jonathan's heart was light, filled with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. The process of building something meaningful, something selfless, had transformed him in ways he hadn't expected. "Grace," he said, setting down his tea, "I can't thank you enough for bringing me back to this. Without you, I'd still be chasing empty achievements, lost in a world of power and wealth." She smiled, a warmth in her eyes that left him momentarily breathless. "You found this path on your own, Jonathan. I may have nudged you, but the rest was all you." He looked at her, his gaze softening. "I feel like I owe you so much more than thanks. You've given me back a part of myself I thought was gone forever." There was a charged silence between them, a quiet understanding that went unspoken yet felt palpable. Grace reached out, placing a gentle hand on his. "You don't owe me anything, Jonathan. I'm grateful to be a part of this journey. And I think your school will bring hope to so many." Jonathan's heart raced at her touch, his mind swirling with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Grace was no longer just his guide or his friend. She had become a beacon in his life, a presence that had reignited something deeper within him. For the first time, he felt a longing for something beyond success, beyond redemption. He wanted to share his life with someone who understood him in ways he barely understood himself. As the weeks turned into months, the dream of the music school became a reality. Jonathan's mansion, once a symbol of his wealth, had been transformed into a hub of activity. Construction crews worked to renovate part of the estate, creating classrooms, practice rooms, and a concert hall for the future students. The energy that filled the halls was a stark contrast to the silence that had once pervaded his life. Jonathan's joy was palpable as he watched the school take shape, each brick and beam a testament to his transformation. The media caught wind of his project, and while some publications hailed him as a philanthropist, others were skeptical, calling it a vanity project. But Jonathan didn't care. For the first time, he was doing something purely for the joy of it, for the lives he could touch, for the chance to leave behind a legacy that was more than material. On the day of the school's opening, Jonathan found himself standing in the courtyard, the sun casting a warm glow over the freshly painted walls and manicured gardens. A crowd of families and children gathered, their excitement filling the air. Some of the children looked nervous, their eyes wide as they took in the grand building, while others chatted animatedly, their anticipation barely contained. Grace stood beside him, her smile as bright as the morning sun. She reached out, squeezing his hand in silent support. "You did it, Jonathan," she whispered, pride evident in her voice. He turned to her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it, Grace. I couldn't have done any of this without you." As they walked through the halls, showing the families and children around, Jonathan felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. This school wasn't just a building, it was a second chance. A way to honor the dreams he had abandoned. A place where young minds could find joy and expression. After the tour, Jonathan gathered the children in the concert hall, where a grand piano awaited. He sat down, inviting them to gather around, their eager faces lighting up as he began to play. The music filled the hall, each note carrying his gratitude, his love for the art he had rediscovered, and his hope for the children who would follow in his footsteps. As he played, he noticed Grace watching him from the corner, her expression one of deep affection. He finished the piece, the final notes lingering in the air, and stood to a chorus of applause from the children. They crowded around him, asking questions, their enthusiasm infectious. When the day finally drew to a close, Jonathan found himself alone with Grace in the empty hall, the echoes of laughter and music still lingering in the air. He turned to her, his heart swelling with emotion. "Grace," he began, his voice thick with gratitude. "This place, it's everything I could have hoped for and more, and it's all because of you," she smiled, stepping closer. "I didn't do this, Jonathan. You did. You followed your heart, and now look at the lives you're touching." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the last of Jonathan's defenses crumbled. He reached out, taking her hand, his voice soft but resolute. "I know I've been lost for a long time, but you've brought me back to myself. I don't want to let you go, Grace. You've become more to me than I ever expected." Grace's eyes filled with warmth, her smile gentle as she returned his gaze. "You don't have to let me go, Jonathan. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." With a surge of courage, he leaned in, and their lips met in a kiss that felt like a promise, a seal on the new life he had begun. In her arms, Jonathan found a peace that no wealth or power had ever given him. He had finally come home, not to a place, but to a purpose, to love, and to the man he had rediscovered within himself. In the weeks following the school's opening, the energy and excitement that filled the mansion-turned-music school was contagious. The once silent halls now buzzed with laughter, piano scales, and the rhythmic tapping of feet as children learned their first steps in dance classes. The grand rooms that Jonathan had once used for formal cold gatherings had transformed into vibrant spaces of creativity, filled with children's artwork, instruments, and notes on music theory. Jonathan found himself visiting the school almost daily, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude each time he saw the students hard at work. He watched as they learned the piano, violin, guitar, and even some traditional instruments, many of them finding solace in music, much like he once had. For the first time, he felt a deep connection to a purpose beyond himself, beyond wealth or power. It was a purpose rooted in giving, in creating a space where others could dream, explore and grow. On a rainy afternoon, Jonathan decided to sit in on a piano class for beginners. He found a seat in the back as the instructor introduced a basic piece. The children stumbled through the notes, their fingers unsure and hesitant, but he could see the determination in their eyes. The sight reminded him of himself as a child, learning to play with the same tentative excitement, and he felt an ache of nostalgia mixed with pride. When the instructor noticed Jonathan in the back, he asked him to speak a few words to the class. Standing up, Jonathan cleared his throat, nervous in a way he hadn't felt in years. Public speaking had always been easy for him, yet standing before these young faces, his words felt deeply personal, as though he was addressing his younger self. "Music isn't just about playing the right notes," he began, his voice soft. "It's about telling a story, expressing something that words can't. When I was your age, I loved music. It was my escape, my joy. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I forgot how powerful music could be. I hope each of you remembers why you're here. Never lose that love, because it can carry you through life's hardest times." The children watched him with wide eyes, their expressions curious and captivated. Jonathan felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of hope and a quiet sense of redemption. As he looked into their faces, he realized that by giving them this opportunity, he was healing a part of himself, reclaiming the love he had lost and passing it forward. After the class, Grace met him in the hallway, her eyes filled with pride. "I could hear your speech from the other room," she said, smiling. "You sounded like someone who has found his place." Jonathan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think I have. For the first time, Grace, I feel like I'm doing something real, something lasting." They walked together through the halls, observing the students as they practiced. The school had become a sanctuary not only for the children but for Jonathan as well. With every lesson taught, every melody played, he felt his heart grow lighter, his soul richer. He had finally found a legacy worth leaving behind. As the weeks turned into months, Jonathan's connection with Grace deepened. They shared countless evenings together, after the students had gone home, talking late into the night about music, life, and their dreams for the school. Grace became his confidant, his partner, and his friend. With her by his side, Jonathan felt whole, more complete than he had ever felt in his pursuit of wealth. One evening, as they sat by the grand piano in the music room, Jonathan played a gentle melody, his fingers moving with a grace he hadn't known in years. Grace listened, her eyes closed, a serene smile on her face. When he finished, she looked at him, her gaze filled with warmth. "You've come a long way, Jonathan," she said softly. "It's beautiful to see you like this." He reached for her hand, holding it gently, his heart pounding. "And I have you to thank, Grace. Without you, I would never have found my way back to this." She smiled, a blush creeping onto her cheeks. "I think you would have found it eventually. But I'm glad I could be part of the journey." Jonathan's gaze softened, a depth of emotion filling his eyes. "You're more than just a part of it, Grace. You've become everything to me. I've spent so much of my life focused on things that never truly mattered. But you, this school, it's all given me a reason to live, to give, to love." Their hands entwined, and for a moment, the weight of their shared pasts, their dreams, and the road they had traveled together settled between them. With Grace by his side, Jonathan felt a sense of peace and purpose that filled every corner of his heart. The impact of the school soon began to ripple out into the community. Parents who had once seen Jonathan as an untouchable, distant figure began to approach him with gratitude, expressing their appreciation for what he had built. Children who once struggled in school found confidence and self-expression in music, their performances bringing tears to the eyes of their families. One day, a young girl named Emily approached Jonathan after her violin class, her face bright with excitement. "Mr. Davenport," she said shyly, clutching her violin, "my mom says that when I play, it makes her feel happy, like she can see what I'm feeling." Jonathan knelt down, meeting her gaze. "That's the magic of music, Emily. It lets us share our hearts, without saying a single word." Her smile widened, and she hugged him quickly before darting back to her class. Jonathan watched her go, a warmth spreading through him. Each moment of joy he witnessed in these halls reminded him that his life had gained a meaning far beyond anything he had imagined. One evening, after a successful student recital, Jonathan and Grace sat together in the quiet of the concert hall, the memory of the children's music still hanging in the air. The evening had been a resounding success, with parents, friends, and families coming to support the young musicians. Each performance met with enthusiastic applause. Jonathan turned to Grace, his heart swelling with emotion. "I've never felt this fulfilled," he confessed, his voice filled with awe. "It's as if I've finally found the life I was always meant to live." Grace took his hand, her smile gentle and reassuring. "I think you have, Jonathan, and you've given so many others a chance to find theirs." They sat together in silence, absorbing the weight of their journey and the joy of the night. Jonathan realized that his love for Grace was as integral to his new life as the music itself. She had become his guide, his partner, and his source of inspiration. He looked at her, his gaze tender. "Grace, I don't want this life without you. I don't just want to share this school with you. I want to share everything with you." Grace's eyes filled with tears, her smile radiant. "I feel the same, Jonathan. You've changed my life as much as I've changed yours. I've found a home here, with you." They embraced, the weight of their love filling the space around them. In that moment, Jonathan knew that his journey had come full circle. He had started as a man defined by wealth and power, but he had transformed into someone defined by love, compassion, and purpose. And with Grace by his side, he felt whole. The next day, Jonathan and Grace shared the news of their engagement with the students and staff, who celebrated with a warmth that filled the halls. Their love became another part of the school's legacy, a symbol of transformation, redemption, and the power of human connection. As the seasons passed, the school grew, welcoming new students, expanding its programs, and touching lives far beyond Jonathan's initial vision. Children who had once felt lost found a sense of belonging in the music. Families who had struggled found hope and pride in their children's achievements. And Jonathan, once a man driven by ambition, found peace in the legacy he was leaving behind. Through the music, through his love for Grace, and through the lives he had touched, Jonathan's life had found a meaning that wealth and power could never provide. And in each note played, each child's smile, he saw a piece of himself. The young man he had once been, the man he had become, and the legacy he was proud to leave behind. Years passed, and the music school blossomed into a pillar of the community. What began as a quiet dream for Jonathan had become a place where children from all walks of life gathered to learn, play, and find joy in music. It was no longer just a school. It had become a home, a sanctuary for expression, and a bridge between people and their dreams. Jonathan watched with pride as the school grew, expanding to offer programs in composition, dance, and even musical theater. The walls that once held only his ambitions and loneliness now held laughter, resilience, and the countless stories of children finding their voices through music. Every so often, Jonathan would walk through the school alone, remembering the man he used to be. The quiet halls reminded him of the mansion's past, its coldness, and how Grace's music had brought warmth into his life. He could still recall the feeling of hearing her play that night at his party, how it had pierced through his defenses and rekindled a part of him he'd thought long dead. Now, her influence resonated in every corner of the school, each note a testament to the love that had transformed him. One sunny afternoon, Jonathan stood on the stage of the concert hall, watching as the students prepared for the annual recital. Among them was a young boy named Leo, a shy, reserved child who had recently joined the school. Leo had initially struggled to open up, but through music, he'd begun to find confidence and joy. Jonathan recognized the boy's spirit, a quiet determination and a hidden passion that reminded him of himself. Before the recital began, Jonathan approached Leo, kneeling to meet his gaze. "You've done wonderfully, Leo. Remember, this performance is just for you. Play it from your heart." Leo looked up, his eyes wide with nervous excitement. "Thank you, Mr. Davenport. I'll do my best." As the recital unfolded, Jonathan sat beside Grace, watching with awe as each child took the stage, their expressions reflecting both joy and pride. Some of these children had come to the school with difficult backgrounds, facing struggles Jonathan knew all too well. Yet through music they had found hope and a sense of belonging. As Leo's turn arrived, Jonathan leaned forward, feeling an inexplicable warmth as the boy began to play. Leo's fingers moved gracefully over the keys, filling the hall with a melody that was both soft and powerful. The music stirred Jonathan's soul, reminding him of his own journey, of the importance of holding on to dreams even in the face of adversity. When Leo finished, the applause was thunderous, and Jonathan felt tears prick his eyes. Each note had spoken to him, reminding him of the path he'd traveled to reach this moment. He turned to Grace, squeezing her hand as they shared a look of pride and gratitude. After the recital, families gathered in the courtyard, celebrating with laughter, hugs, and photos. Jonathan stood at the edge of the crowd, observing with quiet satisfaction as parents congratulated their children, their faces filled with pride. In these moments, he saw the true purpose of his legacy, not in wealth or recognition, but in the lives he had touched, the joy he had helped nurture. In the years that followed, the music school continued to thrive. Former students returned as teachers, bringing with them new techniques, instruments, and styles, ensuring that the school's programs evolved with each generation. Alumni credited the school with giving them not only musical skills, but life skills, resilience, confidence, and the courage to follow their dreams. Jonathan and Grace married in a small, intimate ceremony in the concert hall, with the children and staff as their witnesses. Their love became a story that the students admired, a testament to the power of transformation, forgiveness, and hope. They lived in the mansion, now a lively, warm place filled with music and laughter, each room a reminder of the journey they had taken together. As time passed, they welcomed a daughter, Lily, who inherited their love for music and often wandered the school's halls, exploring the classrooms and watching the students with wide-eyed wonder. Lily grew up surrounded by music, kindness, and purpose, her laughter mingling with the melodies that filled the mansion. For Jonathan, watching her thrive in the school was a joy beyond words, a testament to the life he had built from the ashes of his old ambitions. Years later, during an anniversary celebration for the school, Jonathan was invited to the stage to speak. The concert hall was packed with former students, current students, parents, and friends, all gathered to honor the school's impact on the community. Jonathan looked out at the crowd, his heart swelling with gratitude. He began his speech, his voice filled with emotion. "When I started this school, I was a man lost, someone who had forgotten what truly mattered. I had spent my life chasing things that couldn't bring me happiness. But through the kindness and guidance of one remarkable person," he glanced at Grace, who smiled back at him, her eyes shining with pride, "I found my way back to myself, to the music that had once been my refuge." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the students, alumni, and families who had gathered to celebrate. This school is more than just a place to learn music. It's a place to discover who you are, to find your voice, and to realize that every note you play is a part of something larger, something beautiful. Music has the power to heal, to connect us, and to remind us of what's important. That is the legacy I hope to leave, one of love, resilience, and the courage to dream. The audience erupted into applause, the sound filling the hall with a warmth that brought tears to Jonathan's eyes. He looked down at Lily, who sat beside Grace, her face beaming with pride. In that moment, Jonathan felt a peace that he had never known, a sense of completeness that went beyond his personal transformation. He had built something lasting, something meaningful, and he knew that his legacy would live on through the music, through the lives he had touched, and through the family he had found. As the celebration continued, Jonathan stood back watching as the children performed, laughing and enjoying the moment. His heart was light, his soul filled with gratitude. He knew that his life had come full circle, that he had finally become the man he had always wanted to be, a man of compassion, of purpose, and of music. And as the final notes of the evening's performance echoed through the hall, Jonathan closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. In those notes, he heard the story of his life, the journey from darkness to light, from ambition to love, from wealth to a legacy that would endure far beyond his years. This was his true wealth, his lasting impact. And in the gentle smile of his wife, the laughter of his daughter, and the joy of the children who filled his school, Jonathan found a peace that was as profound as the music itself. His heart, once hardened by the pursuit of power, had been softened by love, by grace, and by the beautiful legacy he would leave behind.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.